Chapter 20, Process Costing. As we learned in Chapter 19, companies that manufacture batches of unique products or provide specialized services use job order costing to determine product or service costs. Smart Touch Learning used job order costing for tracking costs of its tablets. In contrast, companies which manufacture large quantities of homogeneous products through a series of uniform steps or processes use process costing to determine product costs. Examples of manufacturers which use process costing are soft drink bottlers, paint manufacturers, and gasoline refiners. Job order costing accumulates costs by job, but process costing accumulates costs by process. Job order costing uses a single work-in-process inventory account, whereas process costing has a separate work-in-process inventory account for each process or department. Records are kept through the use of a job cost sheet for each job when job order costing is used. When process costing is used, records are kept through the use of a production cost report for each process or department. Under job order costing, the transfer of costs occur when each job is completed. Under process costing, this transfer takes place at the end of an accounting period. Process costing uses one of two methods: weighted average, which is illustrated in the chapter, and first in, first out, which is explained in the appendix to this chapter in your book. As we look at how process costing works, we'll be using Cheerful Colors, which is a made-up crayon manufacturing company for all of our examples. Cheerful Colors has three processes in its production process: mixing, molding, and packaging. The mixing department combines direct materials such as paraffin, wax, and pigments. The heated mixture is pumped to the molding department where it is poured into molds. After the molds cool, the crayons are removed from the molds and transferred to the packaging department where paper wrappers are added to each crayon and the crayons are boxed. The crayons accumulate production costs during each process. The company then assigns these costs to the crayons passing through that process. The total cost to produce 10,000 crayons is the sum of the costs incurred for the three processes, or in this case, $600. The cost per crayon is the total cost of $600 divided by the number of crayons, or a total of 6 cents per crayon. Why does a manager need to know the cost per unit of each process? Knowing this amount enables a manager to control costs. The company can look for ways to cut costs where actual process costs exceed what was planned. The cost per unit is also needed so that the manager can set the selling price. The selling price must be greater than the cost of making the product so that the company can earn a profit. In addition, the cost per unit is needed in order to calculate account balances. The company needs to know the ending balances in work-in-process inventory and finished goods inventory for the balance sheet and the cost of goods sold for the income statement. Exhibit 20-2 provides a comparison of cost flows in Smart Touch Learning's job order costing system with Cheerful Crayon's process costing system. First, we'll look at panel A, which depicts Smart Touch Learning. Recall from the previous chapter that in a job order costing system, direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead costs are recorded for each job. These costs are recorded in the work-in-process inventory account. As jobs are completed, the costs are transferred to finished goods inventory account. Then, when a job is sold, the cost of the job is transferred to cost of goods sold. Note that there is a single work-in-process inventory control account. The work-in-process inventory account in the general ledger is supported by an individual subsidiary cost record for each job. Panel B diagrams the flow of costs for Cheerful Crayon's process costing system. The most obvious difference between job order costing and process costing is that in process costing, each process, in this case mixing, molding, and packaging, is a separate department, and each department has its own work-in-process inventory account. Direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead are assigned to work-in-process inventory for each process that uses them. When the mixing department's process is complete, the cost of the mixture is transferred from the mixing department's work in process inventory account into the molding department's work in process inventory account. Then, when the molding department's process is complete, the cost of the crowns is transferred from the molding department's work in process inventory account into the packaging department's work in process inventory account. When production is complete, the cost of the crowns is transferred from the packaging department's work in process inventory into finished goods inventory. As the crowns are sold, their cost is transferred from finished goods inventory to cost of goods sold. The total cost of the crowns includes the cost of mixing, molding, and packaging. The costs incurred in the first process are transferred to the second process. The costs incurred in the first and second processes are then transferred to the third process. Then the entire cost is transferred to finished goods inventory. So for this try it, match each costing system characteristic to job order costing, process costing, or both. 1. Used by companies that manufacture identical items through a series of uniform production steps or processes. Process costing. Number 2. Transfers costs from work in process inventory to finished goods inventory to cost of goods sold. Both. Number 3. Used by companies that manufacture unique products or provide specialized services. Sounds like 4 has multiple work in process inventory accounts. That sounds like process costing. Number 5, tracks direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead costs. Again, that sounds like, but it also could include process costing, since both use direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead in the process. Exhibit 20-3 illustrates the point that all costs must be accounted for. Because the production process takes time, companies may have products that are not completed and are still in process at the end of the accounting period. We accumulate production costs by process. Then at the end of the period, the total production costs incurred must be split between the following: units that have been completed in the process and transferred to the next process, or to finished goods inventory if it is the last process, and units not completed and remaining in work in process inventory for that department. So looking at Exhibit 20-3, costs are accumulated in Department 1 during the period. At the end of the period, those costs have either been transferred to the next department or they still remain in Department 1. When the production costs have to be split, we cannot just divide the total costs by the number of units started to get a unit cost, because some units are not complete and therefore have not incurred the same amount of costs. The unit cost of the completed units is more than the unit cost of the incomplete units. So how are the costs divided? We use the concept of equivalent units of production. Equivalent units of production allows businesses to measure the amounts of materials added to or worked done on a partially finished group of units during a period to express it in terms of fully complete units of output. Let's see how this is done by looking at Cheerful Colors as an example. At the end of the accounting period, Cheerful Colors has 10,000 crayons remaining in the packaging department. These crayons are partially completed. Each of the 10,000 crayons has the paper wrapper attached, but they are not yet packaged in the box. Both the paper wrapper and the box are considered direct materials for the packaging department. If the cost of the wrappers is 40% of the total cost of direct materials in this process, then the crayons are 40% complete. To calculate equivalent units of production, we take the actual number of crayons and multiply it by the percentage that has been completed for materials. So 100,000 crayons multiplied by 40% is the equivalent of 4,000 crayons with 100% of the materials. The same procedure is used to calculate the equivalent units of production for conversion costs. We multiply 10,000 crayons by the percentage complete for conversion costs, 80% for 8,000 equivalent units of production. Conversion is direct labor and manufacturing overhead. Many manufacturing companies that use process costing are highly automated, so direct labor is a small part of total manufacturing cost. This is why, to simplify accounting, direct labor is often combined with manufacturing overhead and called conversion costs. This term is used because it is the cost to convert raw materials into finished goods. If conversion costs are incurred evenly throughout the process, which is usually true for conversion costs, then the cost of getting 10,000 crowns 80% through the process has the equivalent cost of getting 8,000 crowns completely through the process. Note that the equivalent units of production can be different for direct materials and conversion costs, and therefore must be calculated separately. For this triad, the cutting department has 6,500 units in process at the end of September that are 100% complete for direct materials and 85% complete for conversion costs. Calculate the equivalent units of production for direct materials and conversion costs. So, if they're 100% complete for direct materials, that means that out of 6,500 units, direct materials has the equivalent units of 6,500 because 100% of direct materials have been used. Now, since it's 85% complete for conversion costs, we would simply multiply 6,500 units times 0.8, total of 5,525 equivalent units of production as it relates to conversion costs. For a comprehensive example of a process costing system, let's look at Puzzle Me, a fictitious company that manufactures jigsaw puzzles. Exhibit 20-4 illustrates the two major production processes. The first process is the assembly department, which applies glue to the cardboard and then presses a picture onto the cardboard. The cutting department cuts the board into puzzle pieces and packages the puzzles in a box. The box is then moved to finished goods storage. The production process uses materials, machines, and labor in both departments, and there are two work in process inventory accounts, one for the assembly department and one for the cutting department. We are going to complete a lot of calculations in this chapter. As you work through the computations, keep the picture in Exhibit 20-4 in mind so you don't confuse inputs with outputs. The inputs are materials, labor, and overhead. The outputs are the completed puzzles. A production cost report must be completed for each department. The production cost reports show the calculations for the physical flows and the cost flows of the products. There are 4 steps to preparing a production cost report. The first step is to summarize the flow of physical units. The next step is to compute output in terms of equivalent units of production. The third step is to compute the cost per equivalent unit of production, and the last step is to assign cost to units completed and units in process. There are 2 unique terms used on a production cost report. To account for includes the amount in process at the beginning of the period plus the amount started or added during the period. Accounted for shows what happened to the amounts to account for. They are either still in process or they are completed and transferred out. These terms are used for both units and costs. To account for and accounted for must always be equal. To illustrate the use of these terms, let's prepare production cost reports for Puzzle Me's 2 departments for the month of July. The following is Puzzle Me's data for the month of July for the assembly department and the cutting department. We will be preparing the production cost report using the weighted average method. In Appendix 20A, we will use the first in, first out method. Step 1. We begin with the Puzzle Me's first department, the assembly department. The first step is to summarize the physical flow of units. We begin by calculating units to account for, which is the sum of the number of units in the beginning balance and the number of units started. For Puzzle Me's assembly department, there were no units in beginning inventory, and 50,000 units were started during July for a total of 50,000. Next, we have to account for all the units. The units were either transferred out or are still in process. The number of units to account for must equal the number of units accounted for. The assembly department completed the assembly process on 40,000 units and transferred those units to the cutting department. Therefore, 10,000 units must still be in process. So, we have accounted for all units. Exhibit 20-A shows how units to account for and units accounted for appear on the production cost report. Step 1 completes the units section of the report. Step 2 is to compute the output in terms of equivalent units of production. The assembly department adds all direct materials at the beginning of the process. In contrast, conversion costs are incurred evenly throughout the process. Thus, we must compute equivalent units of production separately for direct materials and conversion costs. The assembly department worked on 50,000 puzzle boards during July. We have already determined that 40,000 puzzle boards are completed and have been transferred to the next department. If they are completed and transferred out, then they are 100% complete for both direct materials and conversion costs in this department. Because the direct materials are added at the beginning of the process, the units which were started have had 100% of the materials added. Therefore, the equivalent units of production for direct materials total 50,000 because all the direct materials have been added to all 50,000 units worked on during July. As stated previously, 40,000 puzzle boards were completed and have been transferred to the next department. If they are completed and transferred out, then they are 100% complete for conversion costs. Only 25% of the conversion work has been done on the 10,000 puzzle boards in ending work in process inventory. As a result, there are 42,500 equivalent units for conversion costs. Exhibit 20-6 shows the updated production cost report with information on the equivalent units. Notice that there are no entries in the transferred in column. The assembly department is the first department in the manufacturing process, so there are no units transferred in from a previous department. We will use this column when we complete the production cost report for the cutting department. Now that we have completed the units section of the report, it is time to complete the cost section. Step 3 is to compute the cost per equivalent unit of production. Separate computations are required for direct materials and conversion costs. We need to take the total direct materials cost and divide by the equivalent units of production for direct materials. The total cost of the direct materials was $140,000. We divide by the 50,000 equivalent units computed in Step 2, and the result is $2.80 per equivalent unit for direct materials. Similarly, we take the total conversion costs and divide by the equivalent units of production for conversion costs. The result is $1.60 per equivalent unit for conversion costs. Exhibit 20-7 shows how we would use the information from Step 3 to complete the costs to account for section of the production cost report. The last step is to assign costs to the units. This step shows where the $208,000 of total costs to be accounted for by the assembly department should be assigned. For direct materials and for conversion costs, the costs must be divided between two categories: the 40,000 completed puzzle boards that have been transferred out to the cutting department and the 10,000 partially completed puzzle boards remaining in the assembly department's ending work in process inventory. This is accomplished by multiplying the cost per equivalent units of production times the equivalent units of production. This process is repeated for conversion costs. So, this step must be completed 4 times to assign direct materials costs to completed units and the in-process units, and to assign the conversion costs to the completed units and the in-process units. The cost of each input must be assigned to each completed output and partially completed output. Exhibit 20-8 shows the completed production cost report. We've now accounted for all units and costs for the assembly department, and it is time to complete the same process for the cutting department. Let's review the cost information presented earlier for Puzzle Me. The cutting department receives the puzzle boards from the assembly department and cuts the board into puzzle pieces before inserting the pieces into the box at the end of the process. Glued puzzle boards with pictures are transferred in from the assembly department at the beginning of the cutting department's process. The cutting department's conversion costs are added evenly throughout the process. The cutting department's direct materials, boxes, are added at the end of the process. Keep in mind that direct materials in the cutting department refers to the boxes added in that department and not to the materials, cardboard, pictures, and glue, added in the assembly department. The cost of materials from the assembly department that are transferred into the cutting department are called transferred in costs. Likewise, conversion costs in the cutting department refers to the direct labor and manufacturing overhead costs incurred only in the cutting department. The conversion costs incurred in the assembly department are also transferred in costs for the cutting department. We follow the same 4 steps to prepare the production cost report as we did for the assembly department. Remember, the amounts that are transferred out for assembly department become transferred in for the cutting department. The units to account for is equal to the units in the beginning work in process inventory account for the department plus the number of units transferred in from the previous department. The cutting department's beginning work in process inventory consisted of 5,000 puzzle boards. Another 40,000 puzzle boards were transferred in from the assembly department for a total of 45,000 puzzle boards to account for. Next, we have to account for all the units. The units were either transferred out to finished goods inventory or they are still in process. Units to account for must equal the units accounted for. The cutting department completed the cutting and boxing process on 38,000 units and transferred those units into finished goods inventory. Therefore, 7,000 units must still be in process. We have now accounted for all units. Exhibit 20-9 shows this information on the production cost report for the cutting department. Just as we did with the assembly department, we start with the units section of the report. Step 2 is to compute the output in terms of equivalent units of production. The cutting department adds direct materials at the end of the process, and conversion costs are incurred evenly throughout the process. Additionally, the units have costs that were transferred in with them that must be accounted for. Thus, we must compute equivalent units of production separately for transferred in, direct materials, and conversion costs. The cutting department receives units from the assembly department. These units are the transferred in units. The equivalent units of production for transferred in is always 100% because these units came in with costs assigned to them from the previous department. The costs assigned to them were calculated on the production cost report for the assembly department. Units completed in the cutting department are 100% complete for direct materials. However, the units that are in process do not yet have any direct materials added in this department because the box is added at the end of the process. Because they are still in process, the box has not yet to be added. Therefore, they are 0% complete for direct materials. Units completed in the cutting department are 100% complete for conversion costs. The 38,000 puzzle boards have been completed and transferred out to finished goods inventory. Only 30% of the conversion work has been done on the puzzle boards that are still in process. This information is added to the production cost report as shown in Exhibit 20-10. The units section is now complete. The cutting department has $233,040 of costs to account for, as illustrated in Exhibit 20-11. The beginning balances and the additional costs incurred were given in the original data. The amount transferred in from the assembly department, $176,000, is the amount calculated on the production cost report for the assembly department for July as the amount completed and transferred out in the costs accounted for section. Step 3 is to calculate the cost per equivalent unit. The formulas to compute the cost per equivalent unit of production are the same as used for the assembly department. We just need to add the calculation for the transferred in costs. The cutting department has 3 inputs and therefore must make 3 calculations for cost per equivalent unit of production. The cost per equivalent unit for transferred in costs is $4.40 per equivalent unit of production. We use the same formula for direct material. The result is 50 cents per equivalent unit of production for direct materials. We repeat the formula for a third time to compute cost per equivalent unit for conversion costs. The result is 40 cents per equivalent unit of production for conversion costs. The information on cost to account for and the computation of cost per equivalent unit of production is added to the production cost report as shown in Exhibit 20-12. The final step in preparing the production cost report for the cutting department is to assign the costs of the 3 inputs, transferred in, direct materials, and conversion costs to the two outputs, completed units and units still in process. To assign costs to the units transferred in, the equivalent units of production calculated in Step 2 are multiplied by the cost per equivalent unit of production from Step 3. This calculation is repeated for direct materials. The same procedure is used again for conversion costs. Exhibit 20-13 shows the completed production cost report for Puzzle Me's cutting department. We have accomplished our goal of splitting the $233,040 total costs between the completed units and the in-process units. For this triad, the finishing department started the month with 500 units in process, received 2,000 units from the assembly department, and transferred 2,100 units to the finished goods storage area. All materials are added at the beginning of the process. The units in process at the end of the month are 45% complete in respect to conversion costs. The finishing department incurred the following costs. How many units are still in process at the end of the month? Well, we look at the amount to account for, which is the beginning balance plus what was added. So 500 units plus 2,000 units equals 2,500 units. So if we have 2,500 units to account for, then we have the 2,100 units that were finished plus whatever's in process. So in process equals 400 units. Number 8, compute the equivalent units of production for the So there you have the computations to complete the equivalent units of production for the finishing department. Number 9, determine the cost per equivalent unit for transferred in, direct materials, conversion costs, and total costs. And there you have the equation and calculations for cost per equivalent unit for transferred in, direct materials, conversion costs, and finally, total costs. Number 10, determine the cost to be transferred to finished goods inventory. We have $16.50 per equivalent unit production times 2,100 units, equivalent units of production, for a total of $34,650 to be transferred to finished goods. Next, we will take a look at the journal entries used to record transactions in a process costing system. You will notice that they are the same or very similar to what we did for the job order costing system. First, let's look at what happens when raw materials is purchased on account. Raw materials inventory, which is an asset account, is increased with a debit, and the liability accounts payable is increased with a credit. Direct materials are used in production in both the assembly and the cutting departments. In addition, indirect materials are used. Work in process inventory accounts for each department are increased with a debit for the direct materials that are used. Manufacturing overhead is increased with a debit for the indirect materials used. Raw materials inventory is decreased for the total of all materials used. Direct labor is used in production in both the assembly and the cutting departments. In addition, indirect labor is used. The work in process inventory accounts for each department are increased with a debit for the direct labor that is incurred. Manufacturing overhead is increased with a debit for the indirect labor incurred. Wages payable is increased for the total of all labor incurred. Additional manufacturing overhead is incurred for depreciation, rent, and utilities. Depreciation is recorded with a debit to manufacturing overhead and a credit to accumulated depreciation. Rent and utilities is recorded with a debit to manufacturing overhead and a credit to cash. Next, Puzzle Me will allocate manufacturing overhead using a predetermined overhead rate. The amounts of the allocation are given to you. To allocate the manufacturing overhead, Puzzle Me will debit the work in process inventory accounts for each department and credit manufacturing overhead. At the end of the month, when the production cost report for the assembly department was prepared, the cost of the units transferred from the assembly department to the cutting department is recorded. The cutting department's work in process inventory account is increased, and the assembly department's work in process inventory account is decreased. At the end of the month, when the production cost report for the cutting department was prepared, the cost of units transferred from the cutting department to finished goods inventory was recorded. Finished goods inventory is increased, and the cutting department's work in process inventory account is decreased. This is the cost of goods manufactured. Next, we show how to record the sale of puzzles on account. The sale increases accounts receivable and sales revenue. It also increases cost of goods sold, but decreases finished goods inventory. Our last transaction shows how to adjust manufacturing overhead. The T account for manufacturing overhead shows that the amount of manufacturing overhead allocated was $500 more than the actual costs incurred. This means the overhead was over-allocated. The adjusting entry for over-allocated or under-allocated manufacturing overhead is usually prepared at the end of the year. We are showing it here at the end of the month so we can illustrate all journal entries for a process costing system. To bring the account to a zero balance, manufacturing overhead must be debited. The credit is to cost of goods sold to decrease the expense account for the amount that the puzzles were overcosted. The diagram below shows key accounts after the journal entries in the process costing system have been posted. Notice how the costs flow through the accounts. What was transferred out of the assembly department's work in process inventory account is transferred in to the cutting department's work in process inventory account. Completed puzzle boards are transferred out of the cutting department and into the finished goods inventory account. The cost of puzzles sold are transferred out of the finished goods inventory account and into the cost of goods sold account. For this triad, Castillo Company has 3 departments: mixing, bottling, and packaging. At the end of the month, the production cost reports for the department show the cost of the products completed and transferred were $75,000 from mixing to bottling, $50,000 from bottling to packaging, and $65,000 from packaging to finished goods inventory. Prepare the journal entries for the transfer of the costs. So, for the transfer from mixing to bottling, we've got a debit to work in process bottling and a credit to work in process mixing, both of $75,000. From bottling to packaging, we have a debit for work in process packaging and a credit of $50,000 for work in process bottling. And finally, from packaging to finished goods inventory, we have a debit of $65,000 to finished goods and a credit of $65,000 work in process packaging. This shows the cost flows from mixing to finally finished goods inventory. So far in this chapter, we have learned how to prepare the production cost report. Now let's consider how managers can use the reports to make decisions for their companies. Puzzle.me uses product cost data to look for ways to reduce costs. This may include changing suppliers to reduce the cost of raw materials or changing a component in the production process to reduce direct materials costs. To reduce labor costs, a manager may need employees with different skill levels paid at different hourly rates. Perhaps more skilled employees would require a higher pay rate but be more efficient. The increase in cost per labor hour may be more than offset by the increased productivity of the workers. Managers may also evaluate the efficiency of the production equipment. Newer, more efficient equipment may reduce manufacturing overhead costs. Production cost reports are also used to evaluate a manager's performance. Managers are often rewarded based on how well they meet the budget. Puzzle.me compares the actual direct materials and conversion costs with expected amounts. If actual costs are too high, managers look for ways to cut. If actual costs are less than expected, the managers may receive a bonus. Another use is to set the price for the product. Puzzle.me's selling price must be high enough to cover the manufacturing cost of each puzzle plus marketing and distribution costs. We know from preparing the production cost report for the cutting department that the total production cost of manufacturing a puzzle Direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead is $5.30. Obviously, the puzzle must be priced higher than this for the company to be profitable. We can also identify the most profitable products. Selling price and cost data help managers figure out which products are the most profitable. They can then promote these products to help increase profits. Finally, the production cost report aids in preparing the financial statements. It provides inventory data for the balance sheet and the cost of goods sold for the income statement. For this try, it describes some ways managers use production cost reports to make business decisions. Well, we just talked about some of them. They can be used to control costs, evaluate performance, price products, identify profitability levels, and prepare financial statements.